There is a growing movement of young biodiversity champions, and throughout this book, you will read fantastic and inspiring stories of Aussie kids making a huge difference to the environment around them. Help plant some seeds and water and tend the plants that grow. Help to build a home for other species and start a movement with your friends. You are the generation that can make the big difference. Come join the Regeneration Biodiversity movement.
Dr. Judy Friedlander is the founder of the Planting Seeds Projects and the Bed and Breakfasts for Bees, Birds and Biodiversity educational program that builds regenerative corridors for flora and fauna. Today I'm talking to Judy Friedlander about her new book for kids, The Bee Squad, Boosting Biodiversity in Your Neighbourhood. Judy, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
First of all, what is biodiversity and why is it so important?
Biodiversity can be best understood by thinking about the words that make up biodiversity. So bio refers to biology or living things, and diversity refers to the diverse range, the many types of life that are on planet Earth. And it's super, super important. It's a big, big issue, and it's a big concept or thing to think about, but it's vitally important. And humans are part of biodiversity, and plants and animals and fungi and insects. So many different life forms are integral and part and parcel of nature and biodiversity.
It's interesting that you mention humans and you write about us, human beings, as human animals. Have we forgotten who we really are?
Yes, I really wanted to draw attention to that because so often when we're talking about nature, we exclude us and our impact. And it's so helpful to think of us as animals because we are basically the same as other life forms. We need one another. We need other life forms. We need to be respectful of that. If we think of ourselves as separate to it, that's where problems really start to emerge. I understand that people can be fearful and there's an element of not wanting to be consumed or dominated so that our health suffers. But I think it's gone way too far the other way. So yes, we have forgotten. And that's a big part of the driving force behind this book and behind the organisation Planting Seeds and the B&B Highway that lies at the back of this book in a way. We just feel that so many initiatives, so many projects don't consider animals, insects and plants, and we really do need to.
A big part of your book talks about pollinators. So let's talk about pollinators. But before we talk about those individual pollinators, the ones that make up the group, tell me why pollinators are so important to us human animals and animals in general.
Pollinators essentially look for nectar in flowers, and then what happens is that they also gather pollen. So in the process of finding nectar in flowers, which is interestingly their carbohydrate, they will collect pollen, and then as they fly away, they will drop the pollen on other flowers, and then that serves to pollinate or regenerate the other plants so that they can grow more seeds and more fruits. So the pollen is a really important part, of course, of all flowers, and that's basically the reward that plants get for pollinators visiting the flowers to collect the nectar. There's this statistic often cited in academic research and literature. 1 in 3 bites of food are connected to pollinators. It doesn't sound very academic. It doesn't sound very evidence-based, but that's essentially what it is. It's also medicines and fabrics and things are connected to the work of pollinators. So without pollinators, we wouldn't be able to have so many foods that we eat. People say, oh, if there are no bees, there's no food. It's not quite true. And of course, bees aren't the only types of pollinators. But it would really mean that our nutrition, our diet would be incredibly impacted. People often will think of the European bee, but in fact, there's 1,700, 1,800 different species of bees in Australia, and they all pollinate. And there's thousands of beetles and flies even that pollinate, and bats and possums and butterflies and beetles, etc., etc. So the book is using a focus on pollinators to really open children's eyes, and adults hopefully too, to the value of all the different species around us, not just to humans, but also to the ecosystem and to nature. They are part of the food chain. Without, for example, a lot of insects, a lot of birds wouldn't have food. And so it goes on. We talk about the bee squad because people love bees. There's no doubt about it. Initially, when we were thinking of the title, I didn't want people just to focus on bees, but I understand that people love bees. It's what they describe as a charismatic species. And once you actually get people involved in understanding, then in bees, then hopefully they get enthusiastic about other species as well. And so the bee squad actually alludes to lots of different bees. And as it turns out, there are so many pollinators that start with B. Not all pollinators, but there's beetles and bats and, well, lots of bugs basically.
Why are bees so important, and why should we give them a helping hand?
So when people think about bees, they often think about just the European bee, the yellow and black one, but that's actually not Australian or not a native bee. It's European, as the name suggests. People associate that bee with food and crops and pollination and how they really help all the flowers to grow. So that's obviously important. And I guess that's the main reason why people are so interested. But what we are trying to do, what I am trying to do with this book is, I suppose, open their eyes to the value of different bees as well, and other different pollinators and different animals to nature. So quite often when I talk to children, I always ask the question, can you name a bee? And most people will say, yes, the bumblebee or the fluffy bee or the European bee. And then I say, yes, that's correct. But did you know that there's a lot more? And then I ask the question, how many species do you think there are in Australia? And we might get 10, I might get 5, I might get 100. And then, of course, as soon as I mentioned that there's probably about 2,000 and we know of about 1,700, they are just astounded. And then I go on to explain how there's native bees that are like European bees and that they produce honey. So most people don't know that. And what's more, those bees that produce honey are stingless. They live in hives and they're stingless. So that's just such an eye-opener. So yes, European bees are important and they are responsible for the pollination of a lot of really important food crops in Australia. But what people don't realise is that other bees, native bees, are also responsible for pollination of food crops, not to the same extent, but they're being recognised as now having a really good role and being encouraged to do so, because we don't want to just focus on one species, as we know recently where there was an issue with the varroa mite. And then, of course, as I said earlier, bees are really important for not just the food we eat, but also just for the web of life and for ecosystems as well.
I've got a couple of favourite bees which live in my garden, which is a habitat garden. I love my blue-banded bees, but my favourite bee, there's a lot of bees in this book, is the teddy bear bee. I'm not sure if they'd appreciate a cuddle from me, but they do make such a wonderful, distinctive sound.
So yeah, that's the really cool thing about bees, I suppose, about so many species, is that there are so many different types. And in fact, I met someone quite recently and he did a PhD on the native stingless bee called the Tetragonula carbonaria, which sounds a bit like a pasta dish. What's more, he just studied the way they reproduced. A lot of people, once they get to learn about native bees, they have a favourite, and the teddy bear bee is really cute and fluffy. I often talk about the blue-banded bee, and the blue-banded bee is an example of a buzz pollinator. So what it does is vibrates, it shakes itself. In fact, they've worked out that it's about 300 times a second in order to pollinate. And people will often say, I've never seen a blue-banded bee, or I've never seen a teddy bear bee. But once you start looking, you'll actually notice. And the other thing that astounds a lot of people is that, you know, they think about insect hotels. So they will tell me, oh, we've built an insect hotel. And I'll ask them how they've done it. And they'll say, oh, we've got basically bamboo and sticks and we've put it into a little wooden box. And then I explain that in actual fact, 70% of Australian native bee species live in the ground. So what I often talk about is how you can help them by making sure that in your home that there's some soil and dirt, that it hasn't been covered with concrete and asphalt, because so many Aussie bees need soil and dirt to lay their eggs in.
Let's talk about ants, flies, and mosquitoes. As far as I can tell, there are plenty of these to go around, and there's quite a few in my kitchen. I've been known to squash a few. Should I be a little more understanding when it comes to these little critters?
A really amazing fact is learning what pollinates cocoa or cacao, which makes chocolate. And so if you ask children, what do you think pollinates cacao, which makes chocolate? They won't know. Quite often I've said, starts with an F. And they'll say, frog? I said, no, it's actually a fly. So that's an eye-opener. I'm not advocating that you have to protect every fly you see, but it's really saying, think more about these other insects. Mosquitoes actually are little flies. The word mosquito means little fly. Again, not advocating that we protect all of them, but it's just a matter of really understanding the importance of so many different insects and opening their eyes to the many different types of pollinators.
Christmas beetles used to be everywhere whenever Santa was on the horizon, but now they're few and far between. I'm lucky to see a handful in summer. What happened?
Yes, a lot of people have noticed that the Christmas beetles aren't as plentiful as they used to be. So it's such a huge issue. I can't say personally what has happened, but we do know that insect numbers are plummeting and that Christmas beetles would be one species where we're not seeing the same number. And that's why, it's one of the main reasons why I felt motivated to write this book as well, is just to start really thinking about, well, what are we doing? Let's connect the dots. Let's think about what we are doing that can help. And a really important bit of information that I put in the book is all about the value of the urban environment to helping biodiversity and helping nature. So a lot of people just think, oh, what can I do? I live in a suburb, I live in the city, there's nothing I can do, because most of the animals live outside the city. Most of the insects and birds live outside the city. That's actually not true. What research has found is that something like a half of all significant plants, that's how they define it, a half of all significant plant species live in urban areas, and about a third of significant fauna, which includes insects. So that's a real eye-opener. And also the research shows that we can help different plants, we can help different animals, insects, birds, if we plant with biodiversity in mind. I'm really passionate about evidence and research, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I did a PhD. My background is journalism. So I'm so passionate in ensuring that the facts are out there. And a lot of people just don't realize how important the urban environment is to nature. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's an academic term called the windshield effect or the windscreen effect. So I always say I'm old enough to know that when I used to go on trips in the car to the country or outside the city, when we came home, our windscreen would be full of dead insects, and it's not being noticed these days. So it's actually a term that's talked about in academic literature. In fact, it's terrible, but sometimes when I'm driving in the country and an insect splats on the windscreen, I'll be really happy because it means, oh, they're out there.
Of course, there's a whole string of other animals that depend on biodiversity. You include all sorts of birds, possums, bats, all the way up the animal pyramid. Are they potential pollinators too?
Yeah, bats are important pollinators, and I describe them as nighttime pollinators, or they take the night shift, and they're attracted to white flowers or light-coloured flowers as well, and the ones that are high up on tree canopies as well. So many of our trees actually rely on these animals to pollinate them as well. A lot of people will say, oh, bats, I don't like them. And I'm always saying they're extraordinary and they are responsible for pollinating so many of our forests, so many of our eucalyptus forests. Another thing I often say about bats is they're incredibly intelligent. So apparently a bat is as intelligent as a dog. I'm coming to their defense.
Your book is called The Bee Squad. How can we become part of the Bee Squad? What sort of things can we do to support biodiversity at home and in the wider world?
The reason why it's called the Bee Squad is obviously talking about the importance of all the different bee animals and pollinators, bees, etc. And squad really talks about how you can be part of a group. Children often feel overwhelmed. There's a lot of research out there that talks about things like eco-anxiety. There's also a term called solastalgia. And the reason why I mention that is I think it's really important to understand that it talks about this deep concern and malaise that people have about loss of species. People feel it on a really deep level, and children do too. And children and adults basically think to themselves quite often, what can I do? Because what I do on my own mightn't be impactful. But when you connect the dots and when you work in a group, it is so much more powerful, so much more powerful. So the book is really trying to encourage children to think about all the different activities that they can do on their own and also with others. So, for example, there's a chapter that talks about nature corridors. So I'm involved with Planting Seeds B&B Highway, which basically plants native endemic plants in schools and does other things as well, like citizen science and habitat creation. And because there's now over 200 in different states, that's very empowering to children who participate. And we tend to do schools in clusters in suburbs. But also this chapter about corridors talks about the value, for example, of street corridors and verge corridors. So I encourage children to plant in their own backyard or balcony and then get neighbours involved by creating a fantastic streetscape of nature as well. So there's this thing there about how about putting a letter into everybody's letterbox to get everybody involved, and there's a template there. Another chapter will talk about the importance of advocacy and starting a campaign and a call to action. Well, how do you do that? You know, if you're really passionate about a particular cause, about plastic pollution or heat in your suburb, what can you do as a group to affect more change? So there's all these fantastic tips and strategies and ways to start a group. Think about how you communicate, how you get the message out, how you might be able to write to your local member or your mayor or your school principal, address your school, how you might be able to delegate and have special roles. How can you think about using the power of the image and a beautiful photograph or an illustration? So the book really covers a lot of ground, and behind each chapter is this concept of working in a group to basically multiply the impact.
I like the way you also highlight a few of what you call biodiversity champions. I was especially interested in Harvey, aged 9, from Drummoyne in New South Wales, who conducted some temperature experiments which showed just how much cooler the area around plants is compared to the footpath and the road. Now, Harvey's quite a scientist, but the Bee Squad lists so many ways to become a biodiversity champion. Where do you suggest a prospective biodiversity champion might start?
I think that there's value in learning about other advocates as well. So by reading these stories, you realise how easy it is to get started. There was a gorgeous child that I spoke to in Adelaide in South Australia, and she learned about this thing called persuasive text at school and wrote a story or an article or a letter, I think, to the newsletter saying that she was really concerned about the local creek and how dirty it was and how there was so much plastic there, and she didn't see many animals and fish. And I think because of that, the principal became aware and said, well, would you like to start a group? And so she did. And so this story is in the book. And so she talks about how wonderful it's been, and everybody calls them mad scientists, which she loves, and that all her friends have become interested as well. And I'll never forget what she said to me at the end. She said, I used to think it was just adults who could make change, but now I know it's not true. I know that we can. So she just started off by having a germ of an idea and communicating it to somebody who could help her. So that's super important. If a child has an idea, you need to encourage them. You need to think about how that can be translated, how you can help them by taking it to another level, by quite often maybe, reaching out to, as I said before, the school or your neighbours or the local newspaper or the member of parliament or politician, that type of things. That's super important. It's just encouraging them and letting them know that they do have power. They have a role to play.
Judy Friedlander, thank you for the buzz on biodiversity, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, and I hope that we all join forces to be a force of nature.
I've been talking to Judy Friedlander about her new book for kids, The Bee Squad, Boosting Biodiversity in Your Neighbourhood. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening.